Hi everybody, this is Organisational Behaviour Buzzy 1029. In this video I'm going to talk about the relationship that organisations have with their environments. The objectives for this session are that by the end of it you should be able to outline and explain some of the main theories that have been developed to try to explain how organisations relate to their environments. So we're going to look at closed, partially open and open systems theories. You should also be able to identify important features of an organisation's environment and explain how those features of the environment can affect particular organisations. And to do so, we're not just going to identify elements of the organisation's environments, but also try to develop a conceptual vocabulary with which to diagnose what's wrong with it. So we're going to use terms like stability, complexity, and some others. And finally, we're going to cover some environment scanning techniques. These are tools that can be used to help organisations understand and respond to their environments. Okay, so what do we mean by the external environment? We mean the range of contexts within which any organisation exists. So this might be the political context, it might be the economy, the economic context, the social context, it might be the technologies that are available to organisations, the laws which determine what they can do, and the ecological or physical environment around an organisation. And the question we really want to ask in today's video is, what's the relationship between all of these factors and individual organisations? Broadly speaking, there's three ways to answer that question. In the earlier videos for this course, we talked about the goal model of organisations. The goal model of organisations rather cuts organisations off from these environments. It's what we might call a closed system perspective. So if you think back to our definition of organisations through the goal model, we talked about how an organisation occurs when a group of people come together and decide that there is some goal or objective or purpose that they want to achieve together. This pictures the organisation as if it's just a group of people and everything they do between each other is completely independent of the wider contexts in which they're acting. Now, it's useful for getting us started in thinking about organisations. However, very quickly when we look around us, it's clear that organisations' goals, the things people want to achieve, don't normally emerge just from within them, just from within the group, but normally refer back to some element of the wider context. A group of people didn't get together to decide they wanted to make an iPhone so they could have an iPhone. They got together to make phones so they could sell them to consumers in the wider economy. They understood wider social trends and technological trends and saw an opportunity. So, one of the first things we can see is that the environment gives many organisations its purpose. It's not just the group of people that form an organisation that come up with the purpose. Often, that purpose is given to the organisation from its environment. The other problem with closed systems perspectives is that members of organisations usually aren't only members of an organisation. They have lives outside of organisations that they can bring in. So you have experiences outside of university which you might bring into the university. Perhaps you're fantastic sports people or really great musicians, and this leads you to play for the university football team or to start a music society. We see this all over the place in skills, in ideas, in knowledge, in techniques. People have lives outside of organisations that they bring in. So the closed system perspective has two key weaknesses which we can just recognise from looking around us. It ignores the fact that the environment often provides an organisation with a reason for existing, it provides its goal, and it also brings in, or provides for the organisation, resources from outside, members, people that want to participate in the organisation. So the closed system perspective is relatively limited. We can improve things by developing what's known as a partially open system perspective. And this perspective suggests that the environment gives resources to the organisation and the environment shapes how the organisation acts. as we've already discussed. A partially open systems perspective would allow us to explain how the environment justifies an organisation, how the environment creates a need for the organisation, gives it a goal. Perhaps, a new law has passed which creates a new body to enforce that law. This is the organisation creating the reason for having an organisation. We can also start to appreciate how the organisation gives resources, the environment gives resources to the organisation, whether that's finance, capital, human capital in the form of members. So this is a partially open systems perspective. The thing with partially open systems perspectives is they focus on a one-way relationship between the environment and the organisation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The final theory is known as an open systems perspective. Sometimes you might see it called a fully open systems or a complex systems perspective. And this takes the partially open systems perspective even further and says it's not only the case that the environment gives things to the organisation, but also that organisations can shape their environments. If we just think about this for a moment, we talked before about a new law being passed that creates a need for an organisation. Well, where did that new law come from? Typically, it would have come from, say, the state, which is an organisation. It might have been pushed for by a particular lobbying group, which might even include the organisation that then becomes justified through the law. The open systems perspective then sees a two-way relationship between the environment and the organisation. It sees organisations as able to shape and change the environments in which they work. So, for the rest of this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the partially open and open systems perspective, just to develop a little bit more depth into each of those theories. Let's start with the partially open systems perspective. In the partially open systems perspective, as we said, we're picturing a one-way relationship where elements of an organisation's environment lead to some kind of organisational response. So this might be changes in the political system, the economic system, so on and so forth, that lead to changes in the organisation. So it might be, let's just think of an example. Perhaps there's a change in the social context where people become more hostile towards authoritative management. Well, this would lead organisations to have to change their management styles. Organisations which had authoritative structures might find them less productive and they'll need to change. Or perhaps there's a new technology that's developed that changes work practices within organisations. The technical name for this is environmental determinism. The problem with it, or for some people the benefit is, it assumes that when something happens in the environment, the organisation will just automatically respond. It doesn't provide us with an explanation particularly as to how the environment changes the organisation. It just observes that it does. There's a couple of explanations we can offer as to how this might happen. One is known as isomorphism or me tooism. Isomorphism tells us that we can see examples of environmental determinism in particular sectors where all organisations respond to the environment in the same way. A good example here would be the university sector. Despite what we advertise about differences between universities, you go to most universities and they'll do 50-minute lectures. They'll do the same things. They'll have libraries. They'll have, Moodle or some kind of online resources. They'll be doing things broadly in the same way. That's because it's quite an isomorphic sector. But not all sectors are isomorphic. So how is it that changes in the external environment could lead organisations to respond in the same way? Another answer is what's known as the evolutionary perspective, which suggests when the environment changes, only those organisations that fit the environment will survive. Now, the important thing here is, and it's often misunderstood about evolutionary psychology or evolutionary science, when we talk about environmental fit, we're not saying the fittest, the best, we're saying the one that best fits the environment. So if we go back to our example of authoritarian management styles, clearly if a culture changes and workers become more hostile towards authoritarian management styles, organisations which are set up around authoritarian management styles, the big powerful boss telling everybody what to do, are going to struggle. So they will not fit the environment. Now, they might be very good organisations in lots of other ways, but they won't fit the environment. So you can think of this like, you might take a tent, which would be great for going to the beach, hiking in a place where there's bears, and what is a great tent for the beach doesn't fit its new environment, and you end up getting gobbled up by a bear. So what this tells us then is that when the environment changes, the organisations which don't fit it will die away, and so everything that survives will fit the environment, so they'll all look the same. This perspective has been used across organisation studies to identify features of the external environment which are changing and are thought to affect all organisations in the same way. A neat example of this is work on organisational eras. This suggests that over time, environments change almost wholesale, like everything changes in the environment, meaning that you have to have particular types of organisations. This is a very detailed slide, which I'm not going to have time to talk all the way through, but we'll just work through it a little bit. So it's argued that in the Industrial Revolution, you had what was called a classic organisation fitting the environment. So in the Industrial Revolution, there was huge demand for new products, a need to mass produce lots and lots of products, which were pretty much standardised. And this led to very hierarchical organisations focused around mass production with repetitive routine work. If you've looked into Taylorism on any of your other courses, you'll know what we're talking about. And an example of this would be something like, the classic Ford factory, the production line, where a worker would go to work and they would be told exactly what part of the car they were making and exactly how to make it, and they'd be given the raw materials by someone else, and everything would be planned out for them. This was the classic organisation, and it was very good at producing a lot of products. By the late 20th century, though, we move into a new era. There's technological developments, there's changes in working patterns, there's changes in society, in cultural values, and what we start to see is a lot of the demand for organisational products shifting away from mass production towards customisation. And this led organisations, particularly those that produced things, to need to change how they worked, away from routine, repetitive work, strict hierarchies, towards more flexible working patterns, towards more local problem solving and team working. And an example would be the shift to something like Toyota. Unlike Ford, Toyota developed various ways of working, modern ways of working. They developed just-in-time production. Whereas instead of people just going and making one thing all day long, and maybe having a big pile of widgets that no one else could use, just-in-time production was based on the idea, if we only need one widget, just make one widget and the worker can go and do something else more productive. So this is not mass production of repetitive work. Now it's much more flexible work. So then the question comes, well, how do you know you only need one widget and what should the worker go and do? Rather than relying on hierarchical authoritative managers, the suggestion in Toyota was put people into teams, into groups, sometimes known as quality circles, and let them figure it out amongst themselves. So if the group doesn't need any more widgets, it can reassign the workers to an area of production that does need more support. This is a modern style of organisation, meant to fit changes in its wider environment. And then it's argued that, particularly since the dawn of the internet, we've seen the rise of the information age, and this has led to postmodern organisations, which aren't so focused on making things, but are more focused on brands and innovation, on selling knowledge or ideas. So they're much more entrepreneurial, much more lean, much more efficient. They don't invest so much in big factories that can only make one thing. Rather, they invest in ideas and brands. And an example would be the shift from Ford through to something like Tesla, which is, one of the most valuable companies in the world, even though it doesn't make a profit. And it's not valuable because of its products, it's not valuable because of its manufacturing processes, it's valuable because of the idea of Tesla. People think it's going to make lots of money in the future. So this is a postmodern organisation. Teslas exist much more in their consumers' minds than they do elsewhere. So organisational eras is one way of identifying very big, broad trends in the environment and working through to the responses within organisations that allow some organisations to fit that environment and to exploit that environment, and others to die away. One of the weaknesses with this approach, though, is it suggests the same thing is happening in every environment to every organisation all at the same time, and clearly that's not really true. We could turn to something like the Ansoff Matrix or Ansoff typology, for a more nuanced account. Ansoff's idea is that there are different environments facing different types of organisations at the same time. So you could have a repetitive environment where there's not really any change, things are very predictable. An example would be something like a hospital where, days of the week might be busier or slower, but a Saturday night in A&E is most likely going to be the busiest time because it's when everyone's out drinking at the pub. You could have an expanding environment where there's slow but incremental change, quite predictable, well planned out change. So an example here would be something like the railway system. It's very rare for the railway system to change really quickly, suddenly. Rather, the changes tend to be planned out many years in advance. So although it is changing, those changes are very predictable. You can have a very changing environment where, even though there is a fast pace of change, it's still relatively predictable. And this would be something like the fashion industry, where every year you're going to have to design a summer collection, you're going to have to design an autumn collection, you're going to have to design a spring collection, you're going to have to design a winter collection. So on the surface, it looks like there's a lot of change, but because that change is predictable, you're able to organise and set up systems of working effectively to actually accommodate those changes. Ansoff then says you also have discontinuous environments where there is a regular change, even though it might be predictable. And a good example here would be universities. University changes are often linked to things like demographics, changes in society. If we know, for example, that there's a lot of 18-year-olds in a particular year, we know we're going to be very popular because there's just more students available. And of course, we can plan for that years and years and years in advance because we know how many people are going to be graduating each year through their A-levels and international equivalents. So although the change is irregular, it's predictable. And finally, Ansoff says you can have surprising environments where there is irregular and unpredictable change. An example here might be the environments faced by the army, where one day they might be going into a country building a bridge, and the next day they might fly around the world and blow up a bridge. And then they might sit down and do nothing for, a year, 6 months, and then fly around the world and do the same thing again or do different things. It's irregular and it's unpredictable. And the point of Ansoff's typology is different organisations face different types of environments. And one of the skills of the organisational analyst is to understand the environment from the perspective of a particular organisation. So a hospital and a university could be operating in the same city, in the same country at the same time, but their experience of that environment could be different. So the Ansoff Matrix is a real improvement. But you'll see how in both the Ansoff typology and the notion of organisational eras, there's a sense in which things change in the environment and organisations have to fit or match those changes. There's no real explanation of the ways that organisations change the environment. We also see this manifest in the work of management gurus. There's a real industry that produces texts for managers and organisational leaders, pointing out changes in the external environment facing all organisations. Like a great example of this would be the work of Peter Drucker, who talks about the new realities facing business, society, and the world. The most recent example of this has been a very popular approach known as the VUCA approach, which emphasises all environments are becoming increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. In other words, and you'll see this again and again, particularly in the work of management gurus, if you think about the Ansoff typology, the assumption is that all organisations are starting to shift down towards more surprising environments. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the claim. But here's the rub. Here's the problem with the environmental determinist perspective. Although isomorphism and the evolutionary perspective help us to explain why all organisations appear to follow their external environment, the problem is we know just empirically not all organisations do fit their external environment in the same way. And this leads us to think about, well, why don't they? How is it that some organisations can be very bureaucratic and some can be very flexible and both succeed in the same environment? Well, there's a whole host of explanations that we're going to look through on the course. The main one, which has been discussed in a lot of the work on environment changes, is the idea of recalcitrance, or sometimes psychologists would call this status quo bias. This was a term developed by Selaznick in his work on the Tennessee Valley Authority dams and public utilities in America. What he found was that workers in organisations, members of organisations, not the leadership, but often the members, were very recalcitrant to change. Once they'd established ways of working, they quite liked the routine, and so they would be resistant to change. However, following this work, more and more organisation theorists suggested it's not just workers that are recalcitrant to change, but also leaders and managers of organisations. And again, we're going to cover some of these ideas in more depth later on, but I just mentioned them now for interest. We have concepts like commitment, which tell us once a leader has committed to a particular decision, let's say to invest in a factory, even if evidence is presented that shows them that that is a bad idea, many leaders tend to become more committed to their decision when there's contradictory evidence. They become more committed to making it work. So they might have invested in a factory to build a product for which there's no demand. Well then, rather than close the factory, they become more committed and say, well, we'll now invest in an advertising campaign to promote this product that nobody wanted. So this is a way of explaining why it is that even though something might change in the environment, organisations don't necessarily change. And when we start talking in these terms, what we start to realise is we can't just explain organisational behaviour by looking at the environment. We also have to think what happens inside the organisation. And this brings us to open systems perspectives, which earlier on we described as a two-way system. And that's a really neat way of thinking about it. If you think about what happens inside organisations, it's clear that many organisations are actually able to shape features of their external environment. Again, Philip Selaznick, in his work on the Tennessee Valley Authority, showed how particularly big organisations can have a real powerful role shaping their external environment. They can shape the legal framework, they can lobby politicians, they can change their physical environment, they have an impact on the new technologies that get developed, the economies, on all these things. These are all mechanisms through which what happens in an organisation can affect what happens in the external environment, that then changes what happens in the organisation. And this is the heart of the open systems perspective. I think it's much more realistic than partial and closed systems perspectives, but it's also, beg my pardon, it's also much more complicated. So let's look at a couple of conceptual toolbox or vocabularies that can help us explain open systems relationships. A good example is the Duncan typology. The Duncan typology helps us to describe the environment through two axes. We have the level of complexity in the environment, so you can have simple environments where factors in there's only a few factors in the environment that might affect the organisation, and they're relatively simple to see what happens. And then you can have complex environments where the factors in the environment are all interrelated with each other, so it becomes much harder to trace a line from a change in the environment into an organisational response. And then the other axis on the Duncan typology is the level of change. So Duncan says there are some environments which are pretty stable, where actually the relevant factors to the organisation aren't changing that much. There might be lots of VUCA around, but in the things facing this particular organisation, it's relatively stable. At the other extreme, you have very dynamic environments where there's a lot of change going on in the relevant factors. So the Duncan typology creates these, these 4 boxes. But what's important for us is to recognise the level of simplicity and complexity is largely a choice of organisations. An organisation could, for example, become highly integrated and dependent on other organisations and therefore exposed to more and more environmental factors. If you are, for example, organised through a just-in-time system, so your factory doesn't have lots of stock and you have to get your stock shipped in from abroad, well, clearly, if there's a problem on the shipping company, your factory can't work. If there's a problem in the suppliers to the shipping company, your factory can't work. There's much more complexity, but that's a choice of the organisation. If the organisation brought all of that in-house, it might cost more, but the environment would be simplified and therefore often become more stable. So the Duncan typology starts to show us how the organisation's choices can simplify and stabilise its environment, and this is a choice that organisations face. Whereas the partially open systems perspective sort of emphasises that the environment forces the organisation to act in a certain way, the Duncan typology says, no, actually, organisations often face a choice. They can often change their external environment. Another way of thinking about this, it's actually quite similar really, is known as the Emery-Trist typology. Like the Duncan typology, it says there's 4 types of environment, which can be described essentially by very similar axes, which is the level of certainty or uncertainty, and the grouping of variables and relationships. So in placid and randomized environments, they're simple environments with low uncertainty and relatively high stability. There's not a lot of change. There's not a lot of uncertainty. And the environment is actually quite simple. There's only a few factors which might affect the organisation, and they're not changing a lot. You could have placid but clustered environments where there's more uncertainty. However, the variables which are affecting organisations are clustered together. So, a change in society leads to a change in the economy, which leads to a change in the political system. So the factors are grouped together, and this makes the environment, although it's still stable, more uncertain, but also still predictable. Then you can have distributed and reactive environments where there's a high level of uncertainty and a high level of instability. There's a high level of uncertainty because the environment is changing and unstable, and there's a low level of relationships between the factors, which mean it can be difficult to make clear-cut predictions because you don't know how the change in one factor, say technology, is going to change the economy, another factor, for example. So that can make prediction difficult. The most changing environments, and the hardest to understand, though, are turbulent fields where there's a high level of complexity, rapid change, and high interdependency between factors, which make it impossible to trace what's going to happen. So these are 2 models, the Duncan typology and the Emery-Trist typology, which try to show us that there's various ways of diagnosing an environment, not just pointing out that the economy affects organisations, which obviously it does, but trying to tell us, well, why does it? Is it because it's clustered with other external factors? Is it because it's changing at a very rapid pace? And so on and so forth. Another set of concepts from open systems perspectives which complicate matters is the notion of stakeholders, and this is theorised through the notion of postmodern organisations. And here the idea is the boundaries between an organisation and its environment are not clear-cut. In an open systems perspective, it's hard to see where an organisation starts and ends, because there are stakeholders, not only members of the organisation. So a stakeholder is anybody who's going to be affected by the organisation, whether or not they're actually a member. So, a stakeholder might be somebody that lives in the local environment whose, natural habitat gets destroyed by a big, power plant or something. So this then helps us to understand how and why the relationship between the environment and the organisation can be even more complicated, because the organisation can make a decision that affects a stakeholder that then affects the wider environment. An example of the postmodern organisation is the tendency among many information organisations to treat their producers as their consumers. And a good example of this would be social media and internet companies like Google, where many of us that feel like we're the users of those products, the consumers, are actually part of the products. We're giving information, we're creating profiles, we're creating searches, we're clicking on things, all of which is used as a product and is sold to advertisers and other companies. And that's how these social media companies make their money. In this kind of organisation, where the consumer is the producer and the producer is the consumer, it becomes incredibly difficult to trace the relationships between the environment and the organisation, because you don't know where any of the boundaries are. And this is the basis of the postmodern organisation. Again, it's not necessarily true for all organisations, certainly true for some, but it does make life very complicated. Okay, so we've spent a bit of time now talking about closed, partially open, and open theories of organisations, and we've covered the Ansoff typology, organisational eras, we've talked about management gurus, we've talked about the Duncan typology and the Emery-Trist typology, which are all tools to allow you to diagnose salient features of an organisation's environment. Before we end, let's just talk about some techniques that you might come across in your careers and might use to try to understand the relationships between an organisation and its environment. Generally, these techniques are known as environment scanning techniques. The idea is they're techniques that allow you to identify and hopefully predict changes in an environment that could have some effect on an organisation. The most commonly cited technique here is known as the pestle. And pestle tries to separate out the factors of the external environment that we've already been talking about. So it separates out the political, the economic, the social, the technological, the legal, and the ecological factors. It thinks about what trends and changes might be occurring in each of these areas and how might they affect an organisation. So let's just work through each one. In the political factor, you've got obviously government policy, but also the ideology of the government. If the government's more market orientated and less focused on the public sector, that has a big impact on many organisations. If you have powerful trade unions, then working practices, management styles might be affected. If you have a lot of war and civil unrest, it might be very difficult for an organisation to access physical resources. So the political environment can have a huge impact on organisations. And for an example of that, we only need to look at the recent events such as Brexit, where a political decision was made which has forced a huge number of organisations to change how they work, for good or bad. That depends on your ideology. But you can hopefully clearly see in the example of Brexit how a political choice changes the reality for many organisations and forces them to work in different ways. The economic environment also can have a real effect on organisations. The business cycle, which means booms and busts. If an economy is going through a boom, there's lots of money, there's lots of consumption, organisations have more capital available to them, they can make investments, they can hire new staff, there's lots of demand for the organisation's products. That might make workers more powerful because there's more demand for work. This can have huge impacts on the organisation. Market structures in particular industries, whether they're consolidated or integrated or separated out. Tax, all these things in the economy, features of the economy, can have a huge impact. Again, for example, go onto Google Scholar or something and look at the relationship between tax changes and organisations. They're clear. A good example of this is what happened in the Great Recession of the early 2010s. There was a huge contraction is the word I was looking for. There's a huge contraction in the economy that meant there was less credit available to the real economy. So that meant it was much more difficult for firms to access borrowing, to borrow money, to invest in facilities, to build factories and so on and so forth. Not because they didn't want to, but because the economy was providing them with less resources. Then we move on to the social factors. This refers to demographic trends, so changes in birth rates and populations, lifestyle changes and social values, particularly attitudes to work and management and consumption. If there is a big push towards, let's say, making things yourself rather than consuming them, well, that constricts demand, which means organisations have less work available, which means workers have less power, management has more power, so on and so forth. If attitudes to work change and people don't want to go to work, or people become very hostile towards authoritative management, all these things change what organisations can do. If labour becomes less mobile, as has recently been the case, particularly in the UK around Brexit, but also around the pandemic, right? It's much harder at the moment for people to move from one country to another quickly. That means organisations are more reliant on labour in their local environment, which means they might not have specialist skills available, or that those specialist skills might be more costly and less willing to work in the way that the organisation wants. We have technological changes. These are new technologies. Often we think of this in terms of high tech, so things like computer power, data, AI, blockchain, and all those kinds of buzzwords. But there's also very low tech changes which have a huge impact. An example of this would be the development of the shipping container. Very simple, a metal box, but the way it was designed meant you get this huge surge of international global trade, of outsourcing, massive changes in the way organisations work, all facilitated by this one small technological change. The L in pestle is the legal environment. This might be new laws, existing laws applied to different types of organisations, human rights, and so on, which clearly change how an organisation works. If a new law is passed to say that workers can only work for a certain amount of time, that's going to change working practices in organisations. If an organisation wins business in a new country or is exposed to new consumers, it might find that it is held up to laws which it wasn't in the past. And a good example of this would be the World Cup in Qatar, where standard Qatari workers' rights didn't stand in harmony with many of the World Cup fans, particularly Western World Cup fans, who saw Qatari workers' rights as being akin to a form of slavery, and they were very concerned at the level of protection, health and safety protection, and payment being given to workers around the World Cup in Qatar. And this forced the Qatari World Cup team to change how they were working, to change their workers' relationships and working practices. And finally, pestle says there's changes in the physical environment. A good example of this would be the shift away from fossil fuels. Irrelevant of the science, it's clear there's a shift away from fossil fuels, which means many organisations are having to change their products and their production facilities. So pestle helps us to separate out all of these factors and to think about which are the most relevant to a particular organisation at a particular time. But the problem is, well, there's a number of problems. That's right. There's a number of problems with it. Firstly is, just done on its own without a purpose, it can generate infinite possibilities, but doesn't necessarily encourage you to think about which is the most relevant factor and which is the most likely to actually happen. Pestle is very poor at predicting what we might call black swan or one-off events. It's very difficult to predict the unpredictable, and this can leave some organisations with a false sense of security. A good example of this, obviously, is the recent COVID pandemic, where lots of organisations use pestles to try to predict the predictable, but when the unpredictable happens, they find themselves very badly prepared. Donald Rumsfeld, a former American politician, used to talk about the known unknowns. Pestle's good at working with those. What's the known unknowns? But it's very hard to predict the unknown unknowns. The other thing is, in order to do pestle properly, you can't just do a little bit of Googling. You actually have to have experts in the law, experts in politics, experts in demography and technology. And hiring all these experts can be incredibly difficult. But we see examples of this in organisations. If you look on YouTube for Google Talks, you see Google's very good at inviting experts in and getting them to talk about changes and trends in each of these areas to allow them to recognise them and think about how they might change their company, either for good or for bad. Pestle, though, is pretty much a partially open systems perspective. It looks at how changes in the environment might affect the organisation, but doesn't really allow organisations to think about their strategic choices. This used to be called long-range planning, and if you look on Google Scholar or on some of the reading that you might get, you'll notice there's an academic journal called Long-Range Planning, which is focused on the ability of the organisation to decide and change the environment in which it operates, to make a strategic choice. And this might be by lobbying through the political system, it might be by developing new technologies, it might be by changing its physical environment, literally moving from one place to another. These are strategic choices that organisations face. Pestle's not very good at identifying them, but long-range planning is a set of techniques to allow people to do that. And an example of this is scenario planning, sometimes known as the shell method. And here, rather than just looking across different organisational factors, what an organisation will do is it will predict an event. It will predict a situation, known as a scenario, and then work through the implications and potential responses for the organisation. So it's almost like a simulation where the organisation thinks, what would happen if this happened? What would we do? And if we did that, what would then happen? Unlike Pestle, this is really good at thinking about out-the-box events and allowing organisations to think not just about risks, but also how could they mitigate those risks. Again, if you look in the popular press around Brexit, you'll see there's a lot of planning that had been done around best, worst case scenarios and reasonable worst case scenarios. This is an example of the UK state using scenario planning to try to manage risks associated with that change in the political environment. Okay, so hopefully we've now met our third learning objective. We've looked at some environmental scanning techniques, but before closing, I just wanted to emphasise I would caution that you don't believe the hype. Whilst management gurus and things like the VUCA model like to emphasise how much more uncertain and complex and dynamic environments are, the reality is that actually for many organisations, aside from one-off, black swan events like a global pandemic, many organisations don't face rapidly changing environments. And for evidence of that, we can just have a look at organisations. It's not very often that organisations completely collapse, nor is it the case that new organisations emerge working differently that radically change entire industries and sectors. For every Facebook, there's a Coca-Cola. For every Tesla, there's a Ford. If you look at the leading brands in the world, lots of them have been around not just for decades, but also for centuries. So this makes it even more important, I think, for you guys, particularly as you move on with your academic and professional careers, to be very critical about understanding the external environment, because it's easy to believe the hype and just think everything's getting difficult. If you go into an organisation and ask its leaders and its managers, is your environment becoming more uncertain and complex? They'll always say yes, but actually that's probably not true for most of them. If you're interested in some further reading, I'd recommend Alvin Gouldner's Wildcat Strike, which is a slightly old book. It's a short book, and in it he explores how a strike in a particular organisation was caused by changes in its external environment, but not just changes in its external environment, also how those changes were mediated or filtered through the organisation's choices, and those choices by the organisation led to changes in the environment, which then eventually built up into this strike. It's a really interesting little book and a nice read. So if you're interested in thinking about this in more detail, that's a suggested reading. Hopefully you feel confident that you've met the learning objectives from this video. I apologise if it's a bit long. I have a tendency to go on, which you'll notice as these videos progress. If you've got any questions, please go on to the Ask Me Anything or discussion forums, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them.